All right, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Welcome to Utopia 1213. And welcome to this extraordinary panel of leading critical theorists, Sheila Ben-Habib, Bob Gooding-Williams, Una Mantena, and Kendall Thomas. Sheila Ben-Habib is perhaps the critical theorist who's done the most to recenter utopia within critical theory. In her landmark contribution to critical theory, Critique, Norm, and Utopia, a study of the foundations of critical theory, which was published in 1986 at Columbia University Press, Professor Ben-Habib revived the concept of utopia, a concept which, along with crisis, critique, and praxis, has played a key role in the history of critical philosophy. The concept of utopia had fallen into disrepute within critical theory in the late 1960s, paradoxically at a time of great reimagining of society. Herbert Marcuse, you'll recall from Utopia 1013, pronounced the end of utopia in 1967. And of course, that was about the time when the first generation of the Frankfurt School and adjacent thinkers like Ernst Bloch would pass away. The concept of utopia was momentarily eclipsed. Jürgen Habermas did not engage it much at all, pretty much, in the two-volume treatise, The Theory of Communicative Action. As Sheila Ben-Habib observed, actually, Habermas's theory marked a shift, in her words, from utopian to communicative reason in critical theory. Axel Honneth as well didn't mention the concept in his first book, The Critique of Power, published in '85. And so the concept went somewhat dormant. And it was really in this book, and thanks to Sheila Ben-Habib, that the concept resurfaced and regained footing in critical theory. The very title of the work, of course, places it alongside key concepts, critique and norm. And a central argument of the book was, in her own words, quote, the need to recover part of the utopian legacy of early critical theory. In this work, Professor Ben-Habib forged a new path to critical theory that incorporated a cautious embrace of utopia from the earlier Frankfurt School, chastened in a way by the practices of new social movements. In the final chapter, Ben-Habib spoke of a moment of communicative utopia, and she proposed a stitching together of universalist and solidaristic principles, drawing both on the Enlightenment strands of rights and entitlements on the one hand, and the critical strands of emancipation, solidarity, community, collectivity, friendship, while emphasizing throughout the importance of valuing our experiences of difference. And over the course of a rich and ongoing intellectual journey since then, Sheila Ben-Habib has crafted that original vision from communicative utopia in her '86 book to a more concrete utopia, which she called a utopia of cosmopolitanism. And so that's our second reading, really, which is the chapter 10 from her book, Dignity in Diversity, published in 2011, chapter 10 on utopia and dystopia in our times. And then she continued to evolve this notion into the concept that I think now I would characterize, using her words, as cosmopolitanism from below. And we have that in the most recent essay posted to the 1313 blog called Cosmopolitanism Reconsidered. Cosmopolitanism from below is perhaps this ideal of equal human dignity and respect for all humans, conjoined with equal respect and generosity towards their cultural, religious, gender, and ethnic differences that finds its generative source from local and transnational grassroots movements seeking to reinvent political community. It's a vision, in her words, in which the universalist ideals of equality and freedom, community, and solidarity find new articulations through local as well as transnational iterations. And this is a reformulation and reconsideration in light of many critiques of cosmopolitanism, including critiques from liberal thinkers like Martha Nussbaum, post-colonial and other thinkers such as Sylvia Wynter, whom Ben-Habib directly addresses in the essay. So there's a search here for a concrete universalism, or what we might call another universalism, which is actually the title of a book that will be coming out, edited by Stefan Eich, who's here in the room, as well as some colleagues of his, Anna Jerkovitz, Nishin Nafwani, and Nika Siegel, a book called Another Universalism, Sheila Ben-Habib and the Future of Critical Theory. Now, so it's a theory of equal treatment and dignity and respect for differences. And this evening, I think part of those differences will be theoretical differences and some philosophical disagreements possible. And so we're making room for that discussion within this space of an intellectual family, at least I consider it my intellectual family here, as we discuss and explore these issues with three brilliant critical thinkers, Robert Gooding-Williams, Karuna Mantena, and Kendall Thomas. And I couldn't think of a more brilliant group of interlocutors for this conversation. I say intellectual family, I really mean it. It's for me a great privilege and really heartwarming to be with you all here today. I first met Professor Ben-Habib when she was teaching at Harvard. We recall well meandering through the dark hallways and chapel of the Minda de Ginsburg Center to study with Sheila, who graciously agreed to supervise my dissertation, and also worked with Karuna Mantena, who we started together in political theory. Having taught as well at Yale as the Eugene Meyer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy, Professor Ben-Habib is now a senior research scholar and professor here at Columbia Law School, and has been a fellow for a long time at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought. I mentioned already my dear friend and colleague, Karuna Mantena, who I'm thrilled to have as a colleague here at Columbia University, who's a professor of political science, and she too worked closely with Sheila Ben-Habib. Her first book was Alibis of Empire, Henry Maine and the Ends of Liberal Imperialism, which analyzed the transformation of 19th century British imperial ideology. And she's currently working on a book on Gandhi and the politics of nonviolence. And with us as well is Bob Gooding-Williams, who, if I recall correctly, studied philosophy with Sheila Ben-Habib at Yale, right? many years ago, and was my extraordinary colleague at the University of Chicago for many years. Did I mention intellectual family? I really mean it. Bob Gooding-Williams joined Columbia in 2013 as the M. Moran Weston Black Alumni Council Professor of African American Studies and Professor of Philosophy and the African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. Professor Gooding-Williams is one of our foremost thinkers and philosophers of 19th century European philosophy, especially Nietzsche, phenomenology, existentialism, aesthetics, philosophy of race, and the history of African American political thought. And his book, In the Shadow of Du Bois, Afro-Modern Political Thought in America, is one of the best works on race, ethnicity, and political thought. And Kendall Thomas is my most inspiring and brilliant colleague here at Columbia Law School, and has been for me one of the most important critical interlocutors here at Columbia. He is the Nash Professor of Law at Columbia University, founder of critical race theory. His writings have been crucial to the development of critical race and queer theory. He's the editor with Kimberly Crenshaw and others of Critical Race Theory, the key writings that founded the movement, co-editor with Judith Butler of What's Left of Theory. He's co-founder and director of the Center for the Study of Law and Culture at Columbia Law School, and the founder of Amendment 13, which is a movement to amend the US Constitution to end enforced prison labor. I couldn't think of a better group to think through these ideas of utopia and cosmopolitanism. I'm going to turn the floor over first briefly to Sheila Ben-Habib for a few short comments. Then we'll go in order, Bob, Karuna, and Kendall, and me, if there's a moment, before we return to Sheila for a longer elaboration in response to our comments. Welcome to 1213, and please welcome our panelists.
So is this a problem? Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know spring is upon us, as is the end of the semester, and it makes it all more difficult to engage in these activities. Thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Fonda, for setting up this event for a book that seems to be aging well. It's now 37 years old, the same age as my daughter, and not quite at the mark of 40. Now, it's difficult to give these introductory remarks just for 5 minutes. But I promised Bernard that I would really go into greater detail about some issues on the listen to my colleagues whom I'm anxious to hear in any event. So let me say that I'm very grateful to Bernard for tracing the trajectory of my work in his written post on the website, which is really quite generous and comprehensive. There is a phrase that he uses in that post, which I think we also said this evening. The phrase is called a cautious embrace of utopia from the early Frankfurt School, chastened by the practices of social movements, end of quote. This is a very apt description of my work, and I want to begin by just saying a few words about this, and indeed, I'll try to keep my time. I have been listening to many of the sessions of these seminars that are, after all, also a course. And beginning with Balibar's lecture in September, I have listened into the session on the Frankfurt School with Mark Bizarre and maybe. But I've also found very inspiring the session in Paris with a young French philosopher, Laetitia Riis, and Etienne Balibar. That gave me a lot of things to talk. Now, roughly speaking, all I want to do in these comments at the moment is just situate my own thinking about utopia in the tradition, quote unquote, of the older Frankfurt School. And we will then discuss some of the other elements of the concept of cosmopolitanism in relation to utopia later. I think that there are probably 3 different traditions of utopia in the older, among the older Frankfurt School thinkers, and Ernst Bloch. I believe is sui generis, he shares some elements, but is quite independent of them all. First is the spirit expressed by the famous phrase of Adorno and Horkheimer in the preface to the Dialectic of Enlightenment, when they insist that thinking the holy, W-H-O-L-Y, you know, whether it's also the thinking the wholly other, das ganze andere, so that earthly terror may not have the last word, is their goal. This is a sentence on the very long sentence from their preface. So this thinking about the wholly other is apocalyptic, in that we are not told whether there are any elements of the present worth preserving rather than completely subverting it. And apocalypse also always contains a moment of destruction within it. But it's clear what Adorno and Horkheimer were saying with the 1942 publication of which the book first appeared in 44 in Amsterdam, and then it was recirculated in 67 among the students in Frankfurt. But what they were basically articulating is an ethical principle which states that another world is not only possible, another world ought to be possible, has to be possible, so that earthly terror does not have the last word. Second is the tradition of Walter Benjamin's messianism, and his views that every revolutionary movement imagines the world anew and contains a moment of redemption. I have been influenced by Benjamin's views, but I have tried to make them less political, theological, and I have interpreted them in terms of Hannah Arendt's concept of the emergence of the new and envisaging the new as a consequence of our political action. But I also strongly prefer talk about them in terms of his famous essay on Gewalt, on the critique of violence, and also the meaning of democracy and not just of violence. Now, the third alternative is the alternative offered by Marcuse, whose 1967 lecture Bernard references in his post, but it's not really about the end of Utopia. One has to be very careful about that phrase, because you have discussed it, right? The end of Utopia is not the demise of utopian possibilities. That's not what Marcuse means. He is playing by saying that utopia, in the Greek sense of Utopia, nowhere has ended because utopia is possible. So it's actually, the title of the lecture is actually the opposite of the argument of the lecture. And, Marcuse is arguing on the basis of developments of contemporary technology, which he's done in more detail in other works, that quote unquote, the realm of freedom in the Marxian sense of the realm of necessary labor can come to an end, the famous statement from Marx that the realm of freedom begins where necessary labor ends. So utopia has ended because it is no longer nowhere, because it is possible here and now. So this is, and Marcuse's view of utopia involves a certain philosophy of history. I think he's the only member of the Frankfurt School that still hasn't given up the kind of Geschichts philosophy. And there is also his very interesting views on technology, which are central to his understanding of utopia. So, final okay. My opposition is indeed a cautious agreement with Benjamin, and that yes, radical movements have messianic elements in them. And I keep thinking of this phase of Martin Luther King, viewing a storm of hope rather than content of despair. I think this is the messianic element. And that yes, we must be able to imagine another world. And I have learned from Bloch, who I think is the most careful analyst of European social and historical realities, the phrase experimentum mundi, experiment in the world. That utopian thinking is also experimental thinking. And I believe this is what Bernard is most interested in also in this work on cooperation. The experimental thinking tests the limits of reality for what seems impossible in the present. And what may be there only as a moment of anticipation, as a fleeting moment, a fleeting gesture. But these moments of fleeting anticipation of solidarity, friendship, community could be taken up by social movements and cultivated further. So much for placing my work more specifically within the context of the themes of this course. And I look forward to hearing from partners.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That's so helpful in precisely kind of fitting yourself within the whole scope of the seminar this year. So thank you immensely. Bob, would you like to start?
Yeah. Everyone hear me? I'm happy to be here this evening to comment on Sheila's work, which, as always, affords a rich combination of philosophical and scientific applications. I'll divide my comments into three parts. First, I want to trace a through line in Sheila's thinking, in particular in Utopia, which is concluding the chapter of Dignity University, to finally from the recent essay Cosmopolitanism, all of which we will consider for our discussion. Second, I want to raise a problem which I am not the first to raise regarding Sheila's treatment of lack of this recent message she characterizes as utopian aspiration, by which she has in mind not the aspiration to a near beyond, but to what seek and describes as the prolongation of the existence the first open possibilities. Third and finally, I'll relate the problem and criticism to Shayla's passing remarks regarding Sylvia Winter's thought. Because I have only 10 minutes, I'll be briefer than I really need to do justice to Shayla's thinking, although I will spend a little more time on Sylvia Winter. I'll leave aside Shayla's criticisms. So what's the through line? As I read the reading we have this evening, the through line is the distinction Shayla draws between one and the other. But Shayla generally conceptualizes. What Shayla generally conceptualizes in terms of the distinction between the generalized and the concrete other. And in CNU, in terms of the distinction between, on one hand, politics of rights and entitlements, province of norms, and what she calls associations of need and solidarities, the province, communities in action, for example, the social needs animated by utopian aspirations. Following Ernst Bloch, Shayla says CNU and DIA, and she says in CNU and DIA alike that utopia is not antagonistic, it complements. On Shayla's view, in other words, legitimate utopian aspiration conforms to the norms embodied in a universalistic, egalitarian, consensual framework, while giving the concrete other its due. That is why she writes that traditional ethnic, racial, and religious communities become communities of solidarities only insofar as they uphold the idea of action in precisely such a frame. So in D&I, as well as in Cosmopolitan Revisited, Shayla offers some examples of the complementarity of norm and utopia. Here I focus on the latter and on the examples she lays out on page 20, all of which are meant to illustrate what Shayla calls cosmopolitanism from below, as well as another phrase she uses as cosmopolitan solidarity. What these examples confirm, whether the issue is the attack on women's reproductive freedoms, LGBTQ rights in Poland, so the stripping of Kashmiri Muslims, Indian citizenship rights, or the deforestation of the Amazonas, is that for Shayla, legitimate utopian resistance complements rather than challenges universal cosmopolitanisms by interpreting them in terms specific and applicable to the demands of the situation. So that's the problem. Now, the problem with all of this, and again, I stress that I'm hardly the first to raise this issue. The problem is that Shayla's account of cosmopolitan solidarity, notwithstanding her talk elsewhere of democratic iterations, and here in Cosmopolitanism Revisited, both new articulations through local as well as transnational iterations, forecloses in advance any and all aspirations to social utopia that would challenge the validity of the putatively universalistic, egalitarian, and consensual framework that the participants in a cosmopolitan solidarity are supposed to share in common. Another way to put this point is to say that Shayla must rule out as illegitimate interpretive iterations of the putatively universal that seem too radically to alter, where she is implicitly committed to that the moral core of the norm, as defined by an interpretation of the norm that she privileges, whatever that interpretation amounts to, bounds the horizon of acceptable, permissible iterations. In at least one sense, then, Shayla endorses philosophical foundations in the way that, for example, Tommy Shelby endorses the philosophical foundation of his own We Who Are Dark. For informally echoing Shelby's account of Black political solidarity, she is committed to the view that all who would legitimately participate in a genuinely cosmopolitan political solidarity, even if they participate from below, must have pre-committed themselves to embracing and not challenging a favored understanding of the norms that ground and orient that solidarity across all the differences it encompasses. Let me turn now to Sylvia Winter, So in Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, the essay of Winter's that shade of science, I take Winter to be first elaborating an account of the episteme or the conceptual framework that in the then current post, this essay was published 2003. So I take Winter to be elaborating an account of the conceptual framework that in the then current post-60s, turn of the century, post-industrial moment served to legitimate bourgeois power. That's the first concern. And then secondly, placing that account in historical perspective. And the emphasis of the essay is on two record to place the contemporary moment in historical perspective. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, say a little bit more about it, about what I take Winter to be up to than Shayla does. So about the story that Winter tells, I think that it involves essentially two claims. So first, that there is a conceptual matrix comprised of a binary opposition between two categories that persists from the medieval Christian era through the early modern era, what Winter calls the era of man one, to our current post-Darwinian era, what Winter calls the era of man two. Sometimes she describes that opposition as between symbolic life and symbolic death, sometimes more simply as between good and evil. Second, the second point that I think is essential to what Winter is up to is that what distinguishes the three eras, medieval man one and man two, is their distinctive representations of what counts as good and what counts as evil, or again, their distinctive representations of life and death. For example, the Christian Middle Ages interprets the opposition between good and evil as an opposition between spirit and flesh. But later, the early modern era interprets it as an opposition between reason and what is to one degree or another lacking. This again is the era of man one, to which Shayla made a paper. Finally, our post-Darwinian modern era interprets the opposition between good and evil as, on one hand, an opposition between the evolved and fully developed human, and on the other hand, this is Winter's phrase, dysgenetic humans, whose inferiority is a function of their less than fully developed, genetically inferior humanity, or often in the case of Blacks, as their utter lack of any degree of developed humanity. This again is the era of man two. So let me say a few words regarding the specifics of the conceptual opposition that legitimates bourgeois middle class hegemony in the era of man two humanism. Much of what Winter says in this vein that we have, more or less repeats the argument of an early 1994 essay, No Humans Involved. This is an essay that Winter wrote in response to the Rodney King uprisings. So what's Winter up to there? So in the era of man one, man two, as interpreted again through the coloniality essay and already No Humans Involved. Winter identifies the good or the evolved with property owners and middle class breadwinners, including members of all races. She identifies the evil with the less fully evolved, that is to say, non-owners and non-middle class breadwinners, the homeless and the global poor, including members of all races at the bottom of Black diaspora. Finally, there are the members of the white working class who regard themselves as, on one hand, less highly evolved than the members of property owners and middle class breadwinners, but as more highly involved than Blacks, for example, Black Americans. Part of what Winter is getting at here is what Du Bois describes as the compensatory psychological witness of whiteness. So two things I hope are evident. The first is the utility of reading Winter alongside Foucault, and specifically Foucault's idea of racism against the abnormal. My idea here is to point to the connection between Foucault's idea that contemporary racism depends on a developmentalist conception of race, and Winter's idea that contemporary humanism depends on the developmentalist conception of the human. Thus, reading Winter through the lens of Foucault, we might be inclined to say that contemporary humanism is a form of racism. And reading Foucault through the lens of Winter's account of the history of humanism in the West, we might be inclined to say that contemporary racism is a form of humanism. The second thing I hope is evident from what I have to say is that there is much more of importance going on in Winter's coloniality essay than what Shayla calls a deconstruction of the legacy of Western reason. In particular, I want to suggest that if we take Winter's larger argument seriously, then we may well come to the conclusion not that the argument, as Shayla says, is inadequate to the task of reinventing political community from below, but that the very aspiration to reinvent political community from below is premature, precisely because it rests on the questionable assumption that the iterated and putatively universal and egalitarian norms informing the cosmopolitan solidarity it invokes stand free of the racist and otherwise dysgenetic humanism that Winter highlights. Indeed, the more important and higher task may well be to critically evaluate that assumption and, if need be, to undertake, borrowing Winter's words, a redescription of the human outside the terms of the humanism era. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for that deep engagement with Sylvia Winter and also your earlier points, which in a way remind me of some critiques of discourse ethics, overlapping a little bit, I think, with the later critiques of cosmopolitanism. Karuna?
Thank you, Bernard, for including me in this conversation. It's, of course, a real privilege and pleasure to reflect with and on Shayla Ben-Habib's work, especially the articulation and defense of cosmopolitanism. All the more so because, as Bernard suggested, Shayla has been an inspirational presence in my scholarly life for a very long time as a teacher, advisor, mentor, and colleague, and still colleagues, which I'm very grateful for. I was also very excited to revisit Critique, Norm, and Utopia. It was the first work of Shayla that I had read as a graduate student before I had come to Harvard, and it's a book that I think is just has definitely aged well, but it's also just a remarkable exemplar of erudition, scope, and precision of political theory. So I'm going to just pose two broad questions, I think some of which has appeared in Bob's remarks, and I think Shayla will address. I can almost anticipate that she's going to address them. So they'll hopefully lead right in there. So one is, so as an overview, I'm going to raise one worry about the utopian element in Shayla's theory of cosmopolitanism, where to locate it, understand its demands, but also to ask if it's utopian enough or as utopian as it could be according to the definition of utopia advanced in that early work. And secondly, I have a worry, or I'm going to voice a worry about the idealism of the idealism of the cosmopolitanism in which Kant is evoked, or maybe a kind of worry about Kant as an idealist. In some ways, that might be arguing against my previous push towards utopianism, but I actually maybe want to raise a question about whether idealism and utopia are in fact that might suggest that they're actually not the same things. And there's probably a third term working around there, which is universalism and where it stands. And I'm not going to raise that. I'm sort of to think through it. So in Critique, Norm, Utopia, Shayla suggests that in important critical social theory, there are two different visions of politics at work. Specifically, it was a reading of Marx about two different visions of emancipation too. One, a politics of fulfillment, a second, a politics of transfiguration, which also map onto the distinction as much as explained and also presented here by Bob, the distinction between norm and utopia. So a politics of fulfillment realizes the implicit but frustrated potential of the present. It is critical and future oriented, but its vision of emancipation is as a culmination of the implicit logic of the present. So here in Critique, Norm, and Utopia, this is the spirit and language of natural rights. More broadly, we could think of it as the language of entitlement, of democracy. expanding and realizing them, taking them to their conclusion. Politics of transfiguration, or the utopian movement, is a more qualitative break, not a culmination, but a negation, a society and a social set of social relations that are radically other and new. Otherwise, they, as I same quote, I think I just paraphrased, bursting open the utopian potential of the old, the new, associated with a community of needs and solidarity, transformed relations, internal and external. Shayla argues very convincingly that a critical social theory needs both. And I think in the more recent work on cosmopolitanism, and this, of course, Shayla will correct me, I'm sure, there seems to be these two lines seem to also be operative. The one dimension, the dimension of norms, the politics of fulfillment, is maybe best as embodied in a commitment to the international human rights legal regime of law, which is the extension and fulfillment of natural rights beyond borders. It's a culmination of a pre-existing Kantian ideal of the equal dignity and worth of all humans, now applied to all nations and communities. Perhaps the space of utopia is found in what Shayla describes as cosmopolitanism from below, association of needs, solidarity, a community of action, which emerges through struggles of the oppressed, exploited, humiliated, and it involves, in part, through that community of action and in enlarging perspectives and an ethical horizon where we can take in the viewpoint of concrete others. So this also maps on, again, on different, thinking about a generalized other and a concrete other. That might be too stark a distinction, so that's maybe my first question, because I also see in Shayla's more recent work that the distinction between fulfillment and transfiguration might actually be more porous. So, for example, when rights are extended to include, for example, the aspiration, demand, struggles of, say, new social movements, or even more contemporary, the women's rights movement, the rights of migrants, asylum seekers, the rights of indigenous people, there is some creative transformation in that act of appropriation of rights language. Seems always to be at work. In fact, Shayla has theorized this process as in the idea of democratic iteration, that invocations aren't just repetitions and invocations aren't just repetitions and invocations, but they change established understandings of rights, and they also, in her language, extend and allow for new agency and authorship. So there is something more going on even in the structure of fulfillment. And I think some of this comes back to a point that Bernard made. It connects to a reading of Robert Huber and the idea of creative generative politics. Now, so if these lines are blurry and more creativity is allotted to the politics of fulfillment, and say here we're talking about the established language of rights, what does this do to the idea of the utopian moment and its potential? The idea of breaking open, being open to, or potentially bursting them open into new ethical relations. So at one level, I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that, in fact, there is something important about the blurriness, that it's both analytically and normatively important to see that any fulfillment can already involve transformation or transfiguration. So, and at the radical end, we can think if you start extending the language of rights, say, to nature, you are fundamentally, in effect, entering into a very new world of social ethical relations. But I do wonder about here, I guess, two questions. One is in speaking of it as iterability, and in a way, I don't see as much of the language of transfiguration in Shayla's new work. So it's part of the question is there's something to be gained by blurring those moments, but it also means that I think it's not as always clear to mark the creativity. Or in another sort of question is whose job is it, or perspective do you note and revise and think of creativity? In some ways, it also could mean that in thinking of it as iterability, you're also appropriating. And there's always this, and I think it sort of comes back to this question a little bit about how open can the language of rights, or ought we think of the language of rights as the space in which we look for the possibilities of otherness of some kind, And here I think, especially when we want to, so this is partial, this is a question, you know, the cosmopolitan from below focuses on association of needs, of solidaristic movements, of joint agency of some kind. But I wonder where the realm of perspective, idea, worldview, alternative ontologies might exist, because it seems that in some way, what is at issue is, especially if we want to extend and allow for new understandings of agency and authorship, seems to me that there has to be a way, this is thinking of Du Bois in some ways, how do we get participants in the extension to feel that they are genuinely co-creators of this new utopian world? So this is actually just a set of questions about, is there a radically other utopian moment in the cosmopolitan from below? And if there is, where is it located in the praxis, in the ideas? And we as interpreters and engagers, where would we look for those sites of potential otherness? And I guess the background question is also, you know, is my reading of your through line of trajectory right, that in some ways, is it that, so is there another model that you're searching for of iteration that actually blurs the line of the way between the filaments? Okay, the last question is a second question, which is, as I say, related in a way to the question of Kant and cosmopolitanism. As Shayla discusses in the article, there is an extensive and has been an extensive, I think, interesting debate on Kant, on race, and on Kant on empire, and whether, and I guess whether in a very early intervention by Jim Tully, there's also, so there's a set of debates, as you know, about the anthropology of Kant and whether there's, it's racism, it's structure, it's theorizing of the difference between peoples. And then there's another set of questions about what's Kant's, both the critique of empire, which certainly was a part of Sanker Muku's book from now 10 years ago, Enlightenment Against Empire, makes clear Kant had a politics that was critical of empire. But as others will note, in the Pacific Federation of States, Jim Tully's critique was that at some level, from some perspectives, the Pacific Federation of States as envisioned by Kant can also look like an empire. So there are moments, and from what perspective is this the case, or empire by the other. Now, I think some of these debates are in some ways are committed to an overly idealistic portrait of Kant. And the debate itself is structured in a way too much in terms of ideals. And here I would say, on the one hand, of whether the ideas themselves can be purged of racist anthropology. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus more on this question of whether and how we defend his, say, cosmopolitanism against various nationalisms. So here I just want to suggest, and I guess to what I think what's missing, or to my mind, what was the crux of the 18th century debate on perpetual peace, and why I think it is still relevant for these really important discussions of cosmopolitanism and the fragility of a cosmopolitan world order, was that I think the 18th century debate was a question about peaceful federation was never a simple choice between cosmopolitanism against republicanism or nationalism as rival utopias. What really mattered for most Enlightenment thinkers was how to move from an existing system of sovereign states to a legalized international order. Kant is pivotal here, not so much for articulating the ends, although of course he does so, but also for outlining a specific historical process by which such legalization would emerge from within and alongside internal democratization or constitutionalization of nation states. Maybe most provocatively, Kant imagined that you had, there's a philosophy of history. He also thought you had to have a series of wars that was going to change people's incentives over time. Now, there is a wider debate, though, and I think the interesting thing is when we focus just on Kant and the ends, we miss that the wider debate on perpetual peace was about specifying the agents, strategies, and mechanisms, not just ideals, but how to bring about this emancipatory or liberal or federated world order. There are many pieces of it: federated politics, enlightened opinion that can support a rights regime, enlightened neutral powers as mediators, So all of this is a wider picture of interstate rivalry, global empire, and ones that, is a picture that we are still living in which you have interstate rivalry escalated because of the interconnections between politics, economics, and culture across the globe. So, but I think having a longer maybe viewpoint is you also see that globalization in their view is a constant set of cycles of expansion, reaction, and constitutionalization. Enlightened federations often collapse because of a critique of an enforced peace or of a critique that they have become empires in fact, so tend to overstep. So I think here there is something to be learned about our diagnosis of our present, to which we think about cosmopolitanism or nationalism as a response. And in a way, the difference between them is internal to that dynamic. So I think here is just a point that, I think actually recovering that picture comes closer to Sheila's own vision of a kind of synced internal and external processes of cosmopolitan rights extension, also with a democratization. That one of the key points of Kant, and I think the professional is that those two moments are interlinked. That's what federative politics requires. And it could come a combination of both. So I think here the last point was just maybe to say that in this moment of, again, thinking through utopias, going back to her first book, I think she raises a number of interesting and maybe both scholarly and political questions about the ways in which critical social theory had, as she says, a central feature of social theory, of diagnosis. And I think that maybe as we enter into a world in which we think the problem of cosmopolitanism and reactive nationalism or populism, then we also need to have maybe a challenge for us to have a more extensive social theory of the processes of globalization that are about, not just about globalization as a process, but this longer history of globalization, which if we think back to Winter, really would start much earlier, that our imagination of both the problems, perils, and possibilities would, at least for our modern world, start with 1492. And, again, as just one response, the debate following out of Kant, part of what drew that debate in the early 19th century was about how to suppress the slave trade. So these were very important older questions about what an international rights regime are, to suppress the slave trade, who's going to enforce that new norm that's being instituted, who has the capacity, and what kind of, what kind of opinion, institution, power can get to behind it. So I think it actually opens up and saves us from what I think Sheila took to be rightly a very limited criticism that people like Nussbaum in that piece of international law or human rights being just a moral aspiration. This is, again, a constant and a serious question for the last 300 years that, again, we have more resources, I think, to think and open up that question, especially from a more critical perspective on the long history of empire contact.
Thank you, Karuna. Thank you, Karuna, for raising both the important questions of the relationship between the international human rights piece, which has been so important to Sheila Bennett, the relationship between that and the utopian potential, and for also raising this question of kind of developing a social theory of globalization. Kendall, we turn to you.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Sheila, for giving us such a rich feast of ideas to choose from. I am not going to ask you, I think Bob asked you 3 questions, Bruno asked you 2. I'm only going to ask you 1, because you're my colleague, and I don't want you to be too tired after working through those questions. And it's a question that's prompted by the draft essay, Cosmopolitanism Reconsidered. I want to ask the question in the same spirit of contentious but constructive dialogue that animates your rich and insightful reconsideration of cosmopolitanism. It's a question I hazard to guess is on the minds of at least some of the the folks in the seminar who read the paper. And it will draw on a different body of literature than the philosophical literatures to which you refer in the paper. So I'm going to pose a question about a specter that haunts your text, and that is the specter of capitalism. A concept toward which your paper gestures once or twice, but never explicitly engages. Now, Max Horkheimer famously insisted, I'm paraphrasing him here, that one cannot speak about fascism and stay silent about capitalism. I wonder whether we might not say the same about cosmopolitanism. Can we reconsider cosmopolitanism today without a simultaneous and sustained reconsideration of contemporary capitalism? Now, you will know certainly that Marx and Engels characterized cosmopolitanism as an expression of capitalism. For them, the concept of the cosmopolitan was linked to capitalist globalization, and specifically to the central character of capitalism, the bourgeois subject. The bourgeois subject of free trade, and an image of freedom, understanding of market freedom as connected to the political freedom of individuals, notwithstanding what today's economists would call the externalities of this freedom, costs to millions of the working class and poor, whose suffering is the price paid for the freedom enjoyed by this cosmopolitan subject. So I want to turn to a really interesting 2006 interview, interesting for me at least, 2006 interview on cosmopolitanism, globalization, and diaspora that Stuart Hall gave. And in that interview, Hall begins by insisting on the close connection between cosmopolitanism as a cultural formation and globalization as an economic formation. For Hall, bringing cosmopolitanism and globalization into the same conceptual field allows us to see that there are at least two kinds of cosmopolitanism which correspond to two forms of globalization. To quote Hall at some length, there is a cosmopolitanism of the above, global entrepreneurs following the pathways of global corporate power and the circuits of global investment and capital, who can't tell which airport they're in because they all look the same, and who have apartments in 3 continents. This is global capitalism of a very limited kind, but it is very different from cosmopolitanism from below. People driven across borders, obliged to uproot themselves from home, place, and family, living in transit camps or climbing onto the backs of lorries or leaky boats or the bottom of trains and airplanes to get to somewhere else. Borrowing a term from Homi Bhabha, Hall calls the latter a vernacular cosmopolitanism, a way of life that is a consequence of the globalization from below. From globalization from above, a regime of inequality and power whose force bears down on people, I'm quoting Hall here, bears down on people who have no choice as to whether or not to become cosmopolitans. Now, Stuart Hall's depiction of what I would call actually existing cosmopolitanism from below, the compulsory cosmopolitanism, if I can use that phrase, of lives lived in the underbelly of global capitalism is, of course, quite different from Professor Ben-Habib's defense of cosmopolitanism from below, and I'm quoting you, Shayla. Cosmopolitanism from below, in which the universalist ideals of equality and freedom, community and solidarity are given new articulations through local as well as transnational iterations. This past weekend, and this is going to come for some of you, at least from left field, but I've been obsessed with an experience I had over the weekend. I found myself on the Las Vegas Strip, in a global city whose topography reveals, for me at least, the imbrication of capitalism, globalization, and the two cosmopolitanisms in a particularly vivid and even for me, again, vertiginous light. I had this feeling of perpetual vertigo, whether I was outside during the day or at night. I mean this quite literally. You may know, some of you, that the 4.2-mile long Las Vegas Strip is apparently the brightest place on Earth when looked at from outer space. So the US News and World Report has declared Nevada's population as, quote, the future face of America. The state's population has more than tripled in the past 3 decades. Nevada has a larger percentage of foreign-born residents than the United States as a whole. The desert state's Asian and Latino populations are higher than the comparable national figures. In 1990, about 105,000, or 8.7% of Nevadans, were born outside the US. By 2021, that number had risen to almost 580,000, or 18.4%. Just under half the state is white. By 2015, it will be a so-called majority minority state. 29% are Latinx. Asian Americans, the fastest growing population in Nevada, comprise 9% of its residents. In Las Vegas's Clark County, the 5th largest school district in the nation, over 150 different languages are spoken. 43% of the state's K through 12 students and almost 50% of its kindergartners are Latinx, and more than a 5th of Nevada's households speak Spanish at home. Tagalog, the official language of the Philippines, is the 2nd most popular non-English household language. The University of Nevada at Las Vegas, which I drove past while I was there, is the 2nd most diverse campus in America. In 2021, Las Vegas welcomed more than 32 million visitors from around the world. Now, navigating the Las Vegas Strip, one cannot help but note the strategic deployment of the global imaginary that gives chaotic order to the city's built environment. The names inscribed on the enormous resort hotels, the Luxor, the Venetian, the Mandalay Bay, the Bellagio, are symbolic projections of the neoliberal cosmopolitanism that configures the identity and experience of Las Vegas's unique brand of casino capitalism in what is technically an unincorporated city called, you can't make this up, Paradise or Paradise. Nowhere is the marketing of cosmopolitan hospitality, that is to say, the offering of cosmopolitan hospitality as a market good, more extravagantly on display than in the Cosmopolitan. And here, you know, I'm going to run this. I hope it runs. I'm sorry that the screen is not here, but I had to share with you. Am I doing this right, Reno? Let's see. Are we on slideshow? Yeah. So this should run on its own stand. Yeah. Nowhere is the marketing of, and you don't have to look at me, just listen to my limpid voice. Nowhere is the marketing of cosmopolitan hospitality as a consumer good more extravagantly on display than in the Cosmopolitan, a luxury resort in the heart of the Vegas Strip. The Cosmopolitan is a boundary-blurring behemoth, a hotel filled with restaurants and bars serving food and drink from all over the world, an international art gallery operation from which guests can buy the work that hangs on their hotel suite walls, and even artwork in cigarette machines that have been repurposed to sell art for $5. A shrine for paying homage to the golden age of Las Vegas, as in these archival photographs, a high-end luxury good retail mall, a mass entertainment mecca where exclusive nightclubs feature performances by international pop stars, and of course, on its ground floor, they are always on the ground floor, a cavernous casino without windows or clocks. In other words, the Cosmopolitan offers its global clientele a market cosmopolitanism if you will, a massified individual experience, which Frederick Jameson has described as the common denominator. He's not writing about Las Vegas, but I think his words are apposite here. That Frederick Jameson has described as the common denominator of late consumer capitalism in America. This is Jameson. Sheer standardization, the production of entities of equal value in the Marxian sense that have no longer anything distinctive or particular about them, but which also cannot count as unique in the sense of singularities. They are thus grotesque shadows of universalities that no longer function to organize anything. Jameson suggests that this new standardization might still nonetheless be thought of in terms of Marx's analysis of commodities. And indeed, the most striking fact about the sensuous experience of casino capitalism is its fetish character. Indeed, there's a kind of a wink and a nod aesthetics in the artwork that is curated by the world-weary New York and LA gallerists who have signed exhibition and distribution deals with the Cosmopolitan. Neoliberal capitalism thus imagines the global public sphere as a capitalist market sphere in which the cosmopolitan subject is not a citizen of the world, but a worldly consumer. Now, the Cosmopolitan, and this is my Hans Hacker move, the Cosmopolitan has a checkered history that tracks the recent vicissitudes of the neoliberal capitalism of which it is a product. The original owner of the property was the New York real estate developer, Bruce Eichmann. The project lender, Germany's Deutsche Bank, had foreclosed on the unfinished property in 2008 in the midst of the Great Recession. In 2014, the Cosmopolitan was purchased for $1.73 billion by the New York-based Blackstone Group, a multinational conglomerate that is the world's largest alternative investment fund. Alternative investment funds invest in everything except stocks and bonds. The Blackstone Group's most recent reported assets total $951 billion. Last year, Blackstone sold the hotel to MGM International for $5.65 billion at a profit of over $4 million. Tellingly, the sale of the Cosmopolitan did not generate a single dollar in real estate transfer taxes for the state of Nevada and its people. Such are the privileges and prerogatives of corporate capital in the age of neoliberal cosmopolitanism from above. Consider the fate, on the other hand, on the other side of the neoliberal cosmopolitan landscape, of the Las Vegans whose jobs and joblessness ebbs and flows with the fate of the casino capitalists who are the city's largest employers. These cooks, cleaners, car drivers, and car dealers have found themselves in the vanguard, even as I speak, of the Americans who have been thrown out of their apartments and bungalows with the end of the pandemic eviction moratoria. Over 970,000 eviction cases took place in the United States last year, and Las Vegas leads the nation in evictions among major cities. According to the Eviction Lab, there were 57,000 evictions in Las Vegas just last year, more than double the number that took place in 2021. Meanwhile, Las Vegas rents have skyrocketed, resulting in conditions of permanent housing insecurity for thousands of the city's residents. What I saw in Las Vegas was a kind of nomad cosmopolitanism from below. The Serbian and Ethiopian and Filipino nationals I met had all migrated to the city in search of the American dream, only to find themselves dispossessed and displaced in a desert mirage. Nick Stevenson has argued that, quote, the impact of neoliberalism the impact of neoliberalism is currently underestimated in much cosmopolitan thinking. It displaces the extent to which the economic can be said to have colonized cultural and political life. So the question I want to ask, there are two ways to put the question. One way to ask the question is to ask whether cosmopolitanism from below as Shayla describes it, can do battle with the cosmopolitanism from above that the Blackstone Group and other captains of corporate capitalism have branded as a kind of market utopia in the Cosmopolitan Hotel. Another way to put the question might be to ask, can Ben Habib's cosmopolitan triangulation of egalitarian moral individualism, multi and interculturalism, and universal human rights legalism, and here I quote Jameson, serve as vehicles and platforms for some renewed public legitimation of hitherto repressed and stigmatized transformational possibilities? What prompts this question is a really important passage in the paper. You devote a whole page to it where you're talking about the modes of justification and reason giving that cosmopolitan must be prepared to offer, right? The account, the normative account that cosmopolitanism from below must be prepared to give of itself. And in a very interesting passage, you say, look, I'm not trying to privilege reason, Western reason. You're open to a communicative reason, that's your phrase, which can encompass a variety of modes, which can indeed involve expressive forms that use the body rather than the voice to convey, to communicate the claims of cosmopolitanism from below. But then you pivot and you say, enough about language. I want to go back to cosmopolitanism. And I suppose what I'm trying to suggest is that by attending to this question of the economic, we are in a position to see how and why the question of language is one that cosmopolitan thinking, directed or animated by a critical utopian spirit, cannot let go of. And I want to use here, in place of your notion of justification and reason giving, Hall's formulation of discursive struggle, which is a phrase that Hall coined in the wake of the defeat the left suffered during the Thatcher years, and the soul searching and self-interrogation that followed in the wake of the victory of Thatcherism. The political victory, and this is actually Jameson in American Utopia, the essay from which I quoted earlier, describing Hall's work. The political victory of neoliberal capitalism and the so-called free market ideology, actually that's me, the political victory of neo-capitalism and the so-called free market ideology to which Mrs. Thatcher insisted in a famous phrase that there is no alternative is an example of discursive struggle. Jameson says that Hall's concept of discursive struggle, quote, posited a process whereby slogans, concepts, stereotypes, and accepted wisdoms did battle among each other for preponderance, or what we might call today hegemony. Thatcher used the rhetoric of market fundamentalism to delegitimize the language of her adversaries and to discredit all the slogans, such as nationalization, that were associated with the post-war labor hegemony her neoliberal policies and programs would replace. In Jameson's words, Thatcher and her party succeeded in rallying what Stuart Hall calls a symbolic majority under the banner of market freedom through a discursive strategy that, quote, deprives the political enemy of its conceptual weapons and at one stroke ages its programs and turns them boring and old-fashioned, unmodern, overused, and unfamiliar. In the American Utopia essay, Jameson goes on to say that this notion of discursive struggle can offer a promising terrain of struggle, right? And it is an argument, he argues, moreover, in keeping with this theory of dual power, that can be made using the actually existing Democratic Party in the United States. His focus, again, is not on global, but as the title of the book suggests, the essay suggests, American utopianism. So I, following Hall and Jameson, would argue for a cosmopolitanism that not only rejects foundationalism, as you urge us to do, Shayla, but also rejects the search for justifications through reason giving in dialogic processes of communicative ethics. I'm quoting you, that you endorse. So you, as I said earlier, deny that what you call the task of justification or articulation of the principles and ideals of communicative reason is a form of rationalism. You write that justification does not preclude other more expressive modes of communication. Nonetheless, it remains the focal lens through which your cosmopolitanism without illusions is imagined and argued for. The problem, as I see it, however, is not the idea of reason giving or justification as such. My concern, rather, is with the instrumentalization of communication as, quote, the attempt to reach mutual understanding, the Ständigung. Now, as I read Sylvia Wynter or my dear friend Emily Apter, who's here, the post-colonial deconstruction of the legacy of Western reason and the postmodern critique of old humanisms, to use Emily's phrase, can be read as aiming to create an empty space, a site for the practice of a critical utopian openness to the other, which accepts and even affirms the validity and the value of agreement without, or perhaps maybe even beyond, understanding. And I would just note here that one of the alternate uses of the German word translates into the English agreement, a meeting of the minds, yes, which is not anchored in understanding. Right? So I will conclude by saying that I'm not entirely, I haven't worked out entirely the connection between the 2 points I made, but I think that this question of the economic, right, as a distinct question, the question of capitalism, of capitalist cosmopolitanism, is a question that has to be asked independently of the appeal on the one side to the language of morality and moral theory, and on the other to the language of law and politics. I'm trying to create a space, in other words, in my reading of your essay, for the value and validity of the question of capitalism, a question which is an important one, but toward which the essay is, at the end of the day, silent. So I would love to know, am I misreading the essay? Is there something there that I could have read and did not around this question of the specificity of the economic and the relationship between capitalism and cosmopolitanism, a connection that we must think through in order to flesh out an account of cosmopolitanism from below that is adequate to our historical moment.
Thank you, Kendall. Thank you for brilliantly tying together these questions of cosmopolitanism from below, from Sheila Benhabib's work to Stuart Hall's work, and for transporting us into the cosmopolitan of Las Vegas. I'm not going to ask. I think there's enough on the I put my comments as you read them on the blog in the introduction, hitting on particularly 3 areas having to do with the role, the juridic role, which plays such a big role in the work, the role of sovereignty, which has changed as well, and the relationship to continuism, some of which overlaps with Karuman. So those are there for you as background, which I think might inform as well some of your responses today. So, but let me turn it then to you to kind of address, as much as you'd like, a lot of material.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, all of you. Let me begin with Ken. Because both Karuna and Bob and I seem to be playing softball, but Kendall decided to take this to another level. So
Another cosmopolitan.
another cosmopolitanism. So let's play hardball. I promised never to go to Las Vegas, and this is difficult because my daughter lives in Los Angeles. Maybe my plane may fall or something, but no, being serious about this, the reappropriation of cosmopolitanism on the one hand by global capital, okay, is not news. Global capital devours it swallows. And the term cosmopolitan is being used in this particular way just to give you a kind of a soupçon of the audience, a kind of promise or openness to the world, of the delights of the world, etc. We all know what that's about. But the serious question here is the term useful as a critical concept? Because historically, it's just simply not the case that cosmopolitanism and capitalism are the same processes for development. Coming from the history of philosophy, I have a different background, as our literary friends sometimes say, and that is also Greek thought and Roman thought. And in Greek and Roman thought, there is a long history of cosmopolitanism, which is what I call thinking outside the walls of the city. It is the cosmos versus the polis. It starts with the rejection of slavery, accepted by the Stoics and the Cynics. And so there is that critical moment within the history of philosophical thought that I'm interested in not losing. But I think your question as to whether retrieving that philosophical history and then onto the 18th century, the various contributions that Karuna talked about, is still useful for conceptualizing today's global capitals. I think that's a fair question. What I'm going to say is that this was not the intention of this essay. This essay is, I think, Emily is also writing for this volume. Deepesh Chakrabarty is editing something called the Encyclopedia or Handbook of Cosmopolitanism, and a great many people who have written about it are contributing with. My task was, more in the philosophical section, and I hadn't been writing on cosmopolitanism for a while, and then I started looking at this literature. I've been reading Martha Nussbaum's book, and I was struck by how she was doing injustice to this concept. So, I'm trying to save myself by saying I defined the problem was partially defined for me and partially undefined. But I think the critical question is a question that you are raising. Can the concept of cosmopolitanism give us all the purchase for thinking about contemporary capitalism? My answer is no. My answer is a straightforward. We need other forms of social freedom. I'm not pushing cosmopolitanism as a kind of comprehensive world. As I begin by saying that there is a moral dimension, a legal dimension, and what Anthony Appiah has worked on is about culture. So it's not as if I'm saying fit everything that needs to be said about contemporary moment into the one that cosmopolitanism. And I can understand that because this is a limited contribution, that it sounded or it came out that way. Now, having said that, there are strong differences, and I would diverge. I have no problem with the concept of discursive struggle. There are many languages, as Wittgenstein says. And discursive struggle is perfectly fine. But what I cannot accept, and what I've said in my work 25 years ago, is something that Utopia said that to speak is to fight. We talk in order to live. If that's the point of what we call the so-called, postmodernist ever series, if that's what the issue is, I'm going to say no. You're going to get yourselves into a performative contradiction. In the sense that if speaking is fighting, why don't you just slap out? Why do you have to say anything at all? I mean, this may seem trivial, but it isn't. It is the point that Plato, precipitous. If we speak only to them, believe me, the one that is the weaker is going to be lose. Because the stronger will always have points in their hands, to overcome us, to oppress us. So I cannot accept that the premise that there isn't some kind of telos, some kind of direction quality to reason, which is, or still reason giving, and that there are many different language games, but one language game in which we always also engage is that we don't understand. This is always what we do. And of course, what was said to harm us many times, look, society is not a university center. I mean, you and I cannot exist if we don't live with the university center. Look at the 88 papers that your colleagues always, write. And of course, there is juristic reasoning, which is different. But I don't accept the argument also that says, oh, well, life is not a university seminar. No, life is not a university seminar. There are discursive struggles, there are struggles in advertisement, there is seduction, about which James also has written. But at some point, we have to be able to talk to each other, communicate with each other. If we don't do that, we cease. We become something else. Okay. I mean, along with any other language games, this language game of our reason giving, of communicating, of wanting to understand the other, of trying to, people can also be interpreted as coming from a view. Now, I think you don't want verstehen with verständigen, because verstehen seems to imply transparency of minds. I think you were thinking of understanding. Here I'm going to use it. Emily, I'm so glad you attended every after. I'm going to use Emily's concept of translation. Verstehen is always a process also of being able, and translation is never perfectly successful. Just as I'm never perfectly successful in understanding my husband, my lover, my friend, my daughter, it's always a process and we'll always fail. But we have to engage in it, and we have to try to give reasons. So I could go on at this, but this is where the battle lines are going to be going. I think it was a brilliant description, very much reminded me of Woodruff, right? Not just Jameson, but Woodruff. And I take your point, truly, I mean, if I develop this essay subsequently and I make a longer monograph of it and so on, the question of contemporary capitalism and cosmopolitanism needs to be brought up. But one more point, which is not really you used Stuart Wall's great phrase, I have to do that, as a vernacular cosmopolitanism referring to the global, um, to the global, prototype. Maybe, and this is a question that comes up in several of this as a, I guess I really haven't done justice to her, but I'm looking for an M2. Yes, but there's also a moment, and because I am studying the immigration law and I teach immigration law, I think we should not exaggerate the lack of agency of the other. Now, and I'm going to give an example, and from that comes together with international human rights law. There are many examples. If you take now the migrant group, this is less the case in the United States in terms of the Latin American migrants from Latin America, but within the European context, and also the Middle East, what has developed is an acute consciousness of migrants' rights. These people, it's just like even on the journey, people are aware of what is in the 51 Convention. They know what is aware in the European conventions. I can give you examples where we are talking about to UN relief agencies, to other agencies, even in Greece, when 2 years ago the migrants burned down their camps. They did this in order to assert, they were basically protesting about being stuck in these camps because they're not given the choice to migrate to the European countries that they want to do. So the question that is emerging is that the vernacular cosmopolitanism is also related to a cosmopolitanism. There's something partially because there are NGOs and civil society groups that are working with the migrants and telling them what their rights are and instructing them. Partially because the piece of communication is like is a slum. And they're talking to groups and relatives and relatives everywhere now. Is this kind of cosmopolitanism from below enough to struggle against global capitalism? Is it, if we're talking about the transformation, is that what I want to say? No, no. Also, it would be a little difficult to call individuals in the middle of an ocean telling the ship of the captain, you have an obligation to tell me on board, because that's what the Lisbon Convention says. Is that a political movement of confrontation and the discursive use of human rights law? Yes, yes. So that's as far as I want to go. I want to go with that. So this comes back. I'm going to come back now to Sylvia. I started reading her about Australia. And please don't take the short references to her in this essay, again, which are stylized as it's as a repeated contribution, etc. As my final word. I'm going to continue. Okay. But what I found, for my purposes, really interesting was her alternative account of modernity. The variant analysis of modernity has been so paradigmatic for so many years, for so many of us, in terms of processes of rationalization. We never think about the other example of modernity. I don't cite the one given by Carl Schmitt in the Normals of the Earth, when Portuguese and the Spanish empires partitioned the world. by drawing a line between, what belongs to one empire and what belongs to another. Sylvia Winter was fascinating for me because of the way in which she linked the origin of modernity to the racialization of the human kind and the geopolitical system. I thought that was extremely beneficial, interesting, and it was probably like that I did not go into the end. It was just much more but I picked up something quite specific, but nonetheless, the conceptual question is this, raised by her essay. I still don't understand the title. Some of you can help me. Unsettling the coloniality of being / power / truth / freedom towards the human after man, its form of representation. Okay. I understand that towards the human after man. I understand that the task, and I would consider myself to be engaged with this task as well, is a reconceptualization of the human being after the feminist and the post-colonial and LGBTQ, whatever. What can we think of the human? Now, I'm not quite sure whether she identifies with is a post-human or whether she just contributes to politics. And I took her to be saying here with the second. And if what she said is how human came to be doing after, man is the classical, Eurocentric tradition with all its faults and warts, then this is a question that I take very seriously. I try to answer. And my answer will be at least a little bit an answer to Bob as well. My answer is that classical, I should say, European philosophy leaves us with bifurcations between reason and appetites, between mind versus body. And undoubtedly, Winter is correct, and other post-colonial critics are correct in saying that these ontological and anthropological propositions get mapped onto racial values. That the other begins, I think of this, I think as far as racism, reduce the Black person to a child, reduce the Black person simply to a dancer who cannot sing, etc. All these awful reductions. Now, it's also interesting that in Sylvia Winter's analysis that she opens a space for Spanish Empire and Spanish colonialism in its confrontation with the American Indian, so that she's not just talking about the racialization of Black people, but she's also talking about the racialization of American Indians, which itself is a very interesting problem and issue. And on that, I think I'm completely on board with her. And this is just a good essay. A lot of people needs to be done and written about it. But where I'm not going to give up is that foundationalism, no, justification, yes. We're going to hold the money. Can I say one more thing?
Of course.
But these are such great questions. Now, thank you for bringing the broader context of conversations about thinking cosmopolitanism. And again, it was an attempt to try to put something behind the content provision in the case of this enormous onslaught of this businesses that is experiencing. But I do want to To the question that was given and God raised. And that is whether be the politics of the politics of transfiguration or involves an process. Am I simply saying that the definition of the terms in this particular and I'm inviting the purpose of the conversation where justice and freedom and equality are relevant. This is not my intention, and I also think that it is not particularly, I'm not going to be modest about this. I think the concept of democratic elections and jurisdiction are part of the way in saying, not possible. In other words, the way I see this conversation about justice or the entire conversation about equality in American jurisprudence, if I can be a bit more, exact than how the conversation is going. These normative terms can be iterated, and iteration, and here is something I didn't learn from Gary Republicans. Iteration does not mean repetition. Iteration means reinterpretation and transformation. So democratic iterations are not democratic repetitions. My idea has always been that new subject groups who say, aren't we also human beings? Aren't we also people that this performative introduces not only the voice of a new subject, but also opens up new domains. I mean, in the case of the women's movement, this was, the challenge about the public and the private. In the case about the free and sexuality, it's about our whole understanding of what the identity. So I always understood iteration as also a transformative development of creative reappropriation. By the way, this is also the Hegelian idea of is never simply that you just take it up, sublate it. Sublation is also always this. So I think forget about this. It helps me in the sense that the discourse ethics is not just a frozen, static language game where the terms are defined. Discourse ethics involves also discursive struggle over these terms. But I have to presuppose some norm of freedom and equality. I must have some respect for your communicative dignity in order for the conversation to start in the first place. Final point. Why is this related to, for those of you who may be coming from Robert Cover's concept of nomos and narrative? Indeed, Cover influenced me a great deal there, because what I saw in his analysis of nomos and narrative was precisely the idea that the law that seems to be such a formalistic sort of language can only survive also within the context of a narrative, and that you cannot control. Robert Cover argues you cannot control the meaning of narrative, and it has this iterative moments. So moments and narrative both of opposing each other, because the law itself is embedded in a narrative which implies the control, but which it once it sees in controlling. So this was extremely helpful to me, this idea of the regenerative. I thank you all again, and there's more to be said, and questions.
Yes. Yeah, there are a lot of things we want to do. including come back to our guests, open it up for conversations, hear from Emily after, who's been interpolated a few times in the conversation. But I'll have to start off though by saying that I don't want to jump into the wrestling pit, but I wasn't totally satisfied with the response regarding the specter of capitalism, which is tied back to Kant and tied to Sylvia Wynter. And the reason is that there's this passage in your text. And so I would just refer to this passage. It's on the bottom of page 2, top of page 3 of your essay, where you kind of narrate the intense interest in cosmopolitanism that's reborn at the end of the 20th century, and that you refer to the Kantian cosmopolitan ideal, right? And you write the Kantian cosmopolitan ideal of, at the top of page 3, uniting diverse countries under the rule of law, respect for human rights, and a free market economy, right? And it's so, and there, of course, and then you've got a slew of quotes of references, including to Habermas, right? Beck and others, Bogue. But it's, in a way, it is, if the Kantian cosmopolitan ideal does, in fact, include rule of law, human rights, but also a free market economy, then I think there's more than a specter, in a way. Then I think there's an implication that means that we may, and in a way, this was the last suggestion in my post, we may need to sever the Kantian conception of cosmopolitanism, or at least the dominant reading of a Kantian conception of cosmopolitanism, or we may need to sever the word, right, and use something else. And that was a short reference to this notion of the importance of naming. But maybe if, in fact, the cosmopolitan Kantian ideal includes a free market economy, then, in fact, maybe we need a different word to talk about. Maybe you need a different word to talk about what it is that is your ideal vision in some sense. And maybe it's time to sever. Maybe it's time to let go of that language. And so that's what I remain a little bit kind of unsatisfied, because it's not just that cosmopolitanism alone in your thought wouldn't be wouldn't be fully copious to address the problems of capitalism, but that there would actually be something in there's a virus in it, almost,
No.
right?
No, I mean, it's just like, okay, that, I mean, I don't really know what the contact benefits. This phrase, I mean, he really was not an economic thinker. He was very, he said, okay, if one's intentions are kind, that one should be able to travel to other countries permission. And Sudan is the German, right? So I don't think that, I think that what I was trying to say was how the European beliefs of the continent ideas had been interpreted within the context of the European countries, because I do say that formally from the communist school, but I think that I should be clear that, you know, whether or not enforced, it wouldn't have been fine. But to derive this kind of vision of the past views, I don't think we could have. I mean, there's some writing that this one context, but does this get me off the hook about the question of capitalism? I have to address that. And if one has to put all on his chips on the table, I go with Amartya Sen. I don't go with prejudice. Amartya Sen has taught that there is room for a certain kind of markets, even within a much more cooperative or much more organized. We cannot completely get the talking, but we can definitely give you certain limits. Or
Well,
I-
it's the free part. It's the free part. Yeah, it's the free part that is troubling. And I'm not sure necessarily it needs to be tied to Kant. The question is whether it's tied somehow to a Kantian notion of cosmopolitanism. In other words, not whether, not whether it's in the original text, but whether it has emerged, whether our understanding of Kantian cosmopolitanism has emerged, and not, and the issue would not be just market or regulation, which there are forms of regulation everywhere. There are probably forms of markets everywhere. It's just kind of like the illusion of free market, the problem, right? Okay, so, so we've got a lot to bring into the conversation. And of course, if anyone on the panel wants to jump in at this point, I think that's totally appropriate because of the back and forth. Otherwise, we can open it up a little bit to other interventions. Maybe we can take 3 and then come back to all of us, maybe, especially Shayla. So let me open it up then for anyone who wants to jump in at this point. And we'll start, and do us a favor and introduce yourself.
My name is Ivan Snook. I'm a recent graduate out of the European Institute, primarily studying under Axel Honneth and applying recognition theory to the laws of war. And the real primary driver of international law, going back to Roman law, jus gentium, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but then also empirically, it's been shown that there's a direct connection between military service and suffrage. And I believe Hegel was very right in his master-slave dialectic that it is the confrontation with death at the hand of another human that develops into a recognition and builds into solidarity. And there is a very powerful solidarity among combat veterans, and I think that this was a powerful source of the transnational fascisms of the interwar period. So my question is, could you please speak to cosmopolitanism and the relationship to war and veterans?
Okay, we're going to take 2 more comments, and Lee, you or have a free pass to jump in at any point. Okay.
Hi. So I'm a second-year law student at Columbia Law School, and so my question is really about how radical do you think this idea of cosmopolitanism is? Because on the one hand, we can have a more less radical, moderate version of cosmopolitanism by sticking to the standpoint of theorization in political philosophy that people like Hobbes through Rawls has been sticking to. That is, starting from theorizing about political philosophy, about nation states, from the perspective that some particular group of people wants to build a sovereign state. And then we have a lot of sovereign states. And then we have some independently important moral principles, and we are trying to use those moral principles to qualify the principles of sovereignty. So that seems to be one of the approaches, and some people might attribute that to Kant. But the other way of thinking about cosmopolitanism is that we are shifting the standpoint of our theorization. That is, we don't start from the nation states as our first principle, but rather we start with cosmopolitanism, and based on that, maybe use the nation states, different cultures, different peoples to qualify our principles of cosmopolitanism. So I'm wondering which of those versions of cosmopolitanism you're subscribing to, and you think cosmopolitanism is really a radical utopian or a moderate one. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sanya Anwar.
Thank you. I'm Sanya Anwar, and I'm a fellow at the law school. And my question, it goes to your point about communication. and he called it communicative dignity. And I was wondering what you thought about placing this idea of communication and the idea of needing communication to understand each other when situated in the digital world that we live in today. And that's, and then especially given how it might not reify national isolationism in the way that we understand isolationism, but it certainly exaggerates, or it has, as we've seen, nationalistic tendencies. And how to view, do we consider this over communication? Is this a version of, you called it communicative vortex created by globalization? So I'm wondering if you were to place that, is this a version of the vortex, this misuse of the internet type, for example, in the context of Rohingya massacre, and that the displacement of certain people and how that's enhanced by this platform. And so I was wondering what you think about the digital world in this idea of needing to communicate, to understand one another. And perhaps it's this over communication, hyper communication, resulting in misunderstanding.
Thank you. Anybody else? Go ahead.
I just build on the last question by, recalling one of these great moments when Auerbach writes to Benjamin from Istanbul and says, everything around me is a kind of condition of Unverständlichkeit. It's Unverständlichkeit, it's untranslatability or ununderstandability. And for me, that was a starting off point for thinking about a translational cosmopolitics, which I do think actually is that other word or one of those other words. It gestures towards the problem of universalizing the law or reason giving or law giving in particular language, and whether it's through maritime arrangements or understandings of sovereign states that have to come to some minimal agreement that and as Balibar says, the language that speaks is translation. But the question then is, what does that universal language of translation that starts to get codified in certain kinds of enlightenment visions of the law, international law, what kinds of exclusions of language and what kinds of forms of Unverständlichkeit are, and this is an easy question on one level, but it's not when you start to think about languaging the law. And for me, anyway, this is a big part of where cosmopolitan discourse goes. It's a form of philosophizing in languages or languaging the law. And it's, Shayla said to me, that's a different archive, but I'd love to see that archive about languaging the law elsewhere really come into some kind of debate, dialogue with a certain tradition of legal reasoning, reason giving, in a sense, how legal ideas are formed within the history of legal from Greek and Roman on. And it's that tension between the in a sense that tradition and the law as a historical form that's very Western, and then this question of languaging and laws in other languages. So it's into that communication.
Okay, let's do this. Shayla, do you want to address some of those, or at least an opportunity to? Okay. Do you, anyone on the? No,
No, let's do that. Because that means and some of the questions are on. Cosmopolitanism and war. It's a long story, but it's no coincidence that answers a political peace. So evidently is the foundation text of and in that sense, there is that. So let me just say that how radical is it? Where do you start? Do you start from the nation state? I'm not talking about nation state systems. It's something that we don't understand in or do in social science or in the law. States emerge in systems within certain context. A nation state never just emerges. You have, I mean, the Western European competition is the best, but it's, it's just like the British paradigm, the French paradigm, then the German and Italian paradigm, etc. So I think about not the nation state, but I think about the system of nation states. Early 19th century developing through late 19th into the 20th. And this has something to do with international law. We cannot talk about it without talking also about its historicity. This thing does not stay because it's historicity, and yes, it is embedded in language, not coming to anybody's point about the language of law. It's extremely difficult. It really is. I mean, just even being able to translate some French and German forms of about the law into American jurisprudence. I mean, these are really incredibly different, different traditions. So you might ask yourself, how do these treaties come about? How do these international treaties emerge? And there is the question of whether there is a read a funnel of the elite. I mean, we know much more about the EU charters. We know the history of the communications between the Arab, Chinese, and French, and the Indian. There are histories, but we don't know enough about the translation in the emergence of other very significant post-war treaties. So that is definitely a space that we have to come up and say, this is a space of, let's put it this way, maybe not controversial, but we have to be respectful of the different differences. There was one more question, so I'm not quite sure I understood the problem of hyper communication and its relationship to national specific, but I don't know if you want to try to explain this a little bit or if we should talk about it. On some location, I totally did not quite understand.
I think it begins with, if the assumption is that the digital space, it can be considered a digital cosmopolitan space, without borders, and in some respects equalizing. There are certain forces that we see that have come about that actually have made it a very problematic space as well. And that's where I was getting to in terms of the idea of communication being necessary to understand one another. When you say that, communication is what is necessary and reason is what is necessary. What we see with violence, for example, that has come about, or certain even intangible harms that result from internet-based cross-border even issues. or even in terms of how migrant crisis is, how that gets translated into visual space. I was wondering what you think about that, and how when you say communication is necessary for understanding one another, is it the type of communication? Is it regulated communication? And also, in terms of what we're saying with Twitter, for example, it's also a space of digital cosmopolitanism is an ideal, or could be an ideal that could, or be a model for an ideal cosmopolitan utopian space. Then the guide rails of capitalism, as we see with Twitter, for example, are embedded within that space as well. So I think my question was really about what you think about the internet space as this communicative realm, and the potentials in it.
I'll be very brief because we're asking the very, very big question that goes way beyond, my ambitions in these papers. But I understand what you're saying about the danger of hypercommunication and also maybe the way in which I'm talking about communication is people unprivileging the world and unprivileged land. And I don't say enough about either non-linguistic forms of communication or develop also what's happening in transformations of language in internet space. That's a very different, it's a whole different problem.
Okay, so what I propose is we take one more round and then we'll come back to the full opinion poll from everyone. Julie Peters, you want to start? Sonia. Thank you so much. Yeah, and that is obviously it's been running through the whole conversation.
Okay, thank you. So I'm very curious about, so I'm really coming as a student, really, and this is a student's question. So I'm really interested by the way you phrased your thinking about communicative reason. Is it, I need to have respect for your communicative reason before even starting to talk. Like, and so that was what I was trying to formulate throughout the talk. Was like, so respect involves maybe implicitly a kind of hierarchy, in which, speaking of below and above, in which communicative reason is above whoever is below it. If I, so that's one question. And so if I understand correctly from everyone's comments today, but there seems to be a relation of complementarity in your thinking between solidarity or friendship on the one hand and universality on the other. I wrote a few pairs now, norm and utopia, and then the generalized and concrete other. And then on the one hand, the language of rights, equality, freedom. And so like on the one hand, and on the other hand, associations, solidarities, social movements in action together, ethnic, racial, religious communities in action. And it seems that, so is what you're saying that there's a relation of complementarity between these pairs of concepts, or is there actually a hierarchical relation between the norm or reason and whatever communities are there trying to justify themselves? And I mean, redundant comment, isn't the norm or reason the invisible particular posing as the mutual universal? Yeah, can I end with one last question, which is my sort of, I haven't thought about it too much, but my sort of discomfort with, speaking of also the archive, discomfort with thinking about the migrant as sort of opening up new kinds of political thinking, or okay, if we, and what comes to mind is, okay, what if we try to think of the kind of people who are the migrants today, but a few centuries ago were actually dominant groups, and what about thinking about medieval Islamic cosmopolitan universalism, which does not, and that's what I was trying to formulate, which does not hide hierarchy, meaning it says that our law, our norm is higher, but will accommodate for other religious laws. Yeah, and I leave that, but thank you so much for.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's have one more comment, and then we're going to come back to the panel and then close up, okay?
Thank you so much. My name is Nikita Sayan. I'm a lecturer at Moscow School of Social and Human Sciences. And yeah, sure. My name is Nikita Sayan. I'm a lecturer at Moscow School of Social and Human Sciences and a visiting fellow at George Washington University. And my question is, I think, a little bit trivial. And you answered to such kind of questions many times. But today, if you look at the rise of populism, the rise of parties, the rise of terrorism, the ongoing war in Europe, it's really tempting to adopt the argument which was developed by Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau against community and utopian projects of Rawls and Habermas. And to articulate this argument, I try to quote Chantal Mouffe, but I'm not sure that my quote will be correct. As I remember, she described both Habermasian and Rawlsian projects as dangerous utopias of perpetual peace or agreements or something like that. So what do you think about this kind of augmentation in current political conditions? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I think we should give Shayla a chance to maybe address those more specific questions before coming back to Bob, Luna, and Kendall to close out with some final thoughts about the entire conversation. Thanks.
I think, your language really differs. I think that's what I heard. Professor, I'm sorry. I'm just going to pick up on the radical right. You said that is taken up also the national side of the Second Amendment. This doesn't quite strike me as being very plausible. I think maybe people in Brazil, they're using the version of the Second Amendment, but I can give you more other examples of where this is happening. Indeed, there is also a kind of abuse, or let's put it this way, there is a reappropriation by the right, definitely also of some of these right-speaking discourse. And this is not exactly pertinent, but I think it was in the same vein. The rejection of judicial review, okay? There are arguments on the left and on the right. Jeremy Walton's argument against judicial review is on the left. The current argument of the Israeli government against judicial review is on the right. And we do know that much of the background for the rejection of judicial review by the Israeli Supreme Court was financed and prepared also with the aid of the Federalist Society. And this is also the case in Orban, with Orban in Hungary and Poland. So in a person step, as the French would say. So there is definitely that going in the arm. I don't quite know what to say about algorithms being neutral. Again, I'm not quite sure. I haven't thought about that. It's a little too much to decide, but thank you for the first point. Doha, I think was your name. If I understood you correctly, and I'll just sort of translate this, we're saying, are these pairs like the rights and entitlement, solidarity and friendship, or sometimes I say politics of fulfillment, politics of transfiguration? Is it a relationship of hierarchy or complementarity? I intended it as a complementarity, except that one has to be very careful in using the discourse of community or association, etc. And one has to see that sometimes there are also tensions. It's not just, complementarity is not just additive. As with most in philosophy, there will also be moments of tension. Right? I mean, many people will say, can you really universalize solidarity? And without being able to think about solidarity, in that way, without being able to think about the tension of universal and particular, we end up with very bland generalizations. And I'm still with Hegel that the tension is always keeping the particular within the universal. If that helps you, I don't know what to say about the Muslim medieval Islamic. Well, maybe we can talk about it at some point, which I know more about. I don't. The question about, of course, I do abortion Tarfus and Mr. Laclau's work. And particularly, I think Laclau's work on populism and so on has been helping me a great deal. This is, it's just, if the whole point of agonistic politics is contention and disagreement and competition. I have no problems. But if the concept by the concept of agnostic politics is meant a healthy goals and revival of punishment, I do have problems. And there is a kind of realism that you purchase in that political philosophy, which to me is what, you can say, it's again, it's the schlichterliche. It's the infernal eternal. So what is the big deal about confirming a world with continuing war? Confirming a world without war is what makes courage. So I don't quite understand if we are going to just be, realists and, I read or very carefully, but are we going to use him as the guide, for our world? Mr. Putin is this amalgamation of, Schmidt and Hegel that led him to come up and talk about a Ruskimir, a Russian world, saying to the Ukraine, I don't want to get political, but I feel very passionate about this. This is not what our philosophy should be. I'm not saying that this is what Trump does, but I'm not quite sure sometimes where the line is up between affirming this philosophy of fighting and agonism, etc. Is it a description? Is it a prescription? Just
Okay, thank you. And thank you for addressing the question so directly, Shayla. So let's have some concluding thoughts, I think, from the panel, starting with you, Bob, about maybe the whole conversation, but also the responses from certain interviewers.
So, yeah, I just respond to the last thing that Jill said in response to the criticism I suggested, which I think may have something with the point that I was making a little bit with what we have this slide. We have exclusions that obtain in the context of languaging, languaging translation, is that the phrase? Languaging, sorry, languaging. So Shayla, you said to me, well, look, ultimately we have to communicate, a fundamental process is respecting, showing some measures, showing respect. And granting that, I think it's still important to note that we think to do that, you always operate with some understanding of what showing respect for my humanity or my dignity involves. And to the extent that one is always operating with a specific understanding of what that involves, the question is really to be raised, does what it involves, so is what it involves, as it were, informed by or contaminated, let's say, an exclusionary conception of the human, or an exclusionary conception of what counts as respecting human dignity. That question just always has to be raised. And my point is, that question is prior raising that question. It's always that has a certain kind of priority. This is like this winter inspired, and raising that question always has a priority. Vis-a-vis, within race, solidarity. So the word is yeah, and so I think that the word always that it's presented as ideally as
Thank you, Bob. Karuna?
General conversation. I think I just wanted to ask, the question in a way was, thinking about iteration as a creative innovation. Sorry. Sorry. I was thinking, I do wonder, I guess, if, and I think it might be different from the perspective of the actor and the perspective of the analyst, because I think on the one hand, I agree with you that, you can see again, I want that you can see it in Martin Luther King, say with the Du Bois, you can see a very particular kind of politics of fulfillment as a strategic argument. We're talking a little bit about, the civil rights or enfranchisement. This completes the constitutional dream. A certain kind of American experiment is fulfilled, and that's strategic because it's meant to be inclusive and it's supposed to give a certain kind of ethical orientation, to the movement. But we know in other ways, it's a genuinely creative moment. Again, Du Bois will say something like this iteration of democracy is both expanding it and changing it, in some form. But I wonder, so from the perspective of, at times, from both the actor and the analyst, there are going to be moments in which you emphasize the fulfillment as literal fulfillment. And sometimes as an analyst, we can see its creativity. It's sort of like the process of generativity itself, how law functions in a precedent-making way. But I think the issue is, if that's, it's just a series of questions to think with, and I'll think about it later, with you later too. It's just, sometimes I worry, I guess the worry is law the model? Is law the analogy? Is law a model, or is law the exemplar? I worry because in some ways, when we really take law as the only model, then it can be static. It's sort of, again, in Du Bois, there's a distinction between constitutional fetishism, we were talking about this, versus democratic iteration, which can be outside the law. These are norms that are recreated and have their potential. And I guess it's a little bit about maybe if it's too connected to law as a model, not just an analogy, then the creativity can be stifled, whether it ends up being hierarchical or restrictive to a pre-existing fulfillment in a pre-existing way. So to me, it's just an interesting way, and it challenges me to also think about that this might, how we analyze it will make, any particular moment can be reread as creative, as you say. So that's thinking with you, I think. So I want to retain your older structure to rethink the utopian back into this, into fulfillment.
Thank you, Karuna. Kendall.
So Shayla, you helped me clarify the point that I might have made if I had thought to the end of my interest in the question of the relationship between capitalism and cosmopolitanism. I want to claim that thinking about capitalism, which is not just a system, but an historical system, helps us historicize cosmopolitanism. I don't deny that the roots, the historical roots of cosmopolitanism, the aspiration to be a citizen of the world dates back to Diogenes. But, I don't live in the world that Diogenes inhabited, and he certainly couldn't have imagined, no more than the framers of our Constitution could imagine what it means to engage with the question of cosmopolitanism today, particularly under conditions in which we are arguably also experiencing forms of capitalism as a system, which are historically unprecedented, right? That's the effort to join neoliberalism and cosmopolitanism, because neoliberalism aspires to a kind of totalizing reach in which everything is marketized, and in which there would be no space for an Amartya Sen, right? And a vision of a political economy in which there would be space for economic interactions that weren't about bargain for exchanges in an impersonal market. And so by thinking these questions historically, we can be sensitive not just to the continuities over time in the way we talk about cosmopolitanism, but to the discontinuities. Right? And I suppose that's the value for me of introducing the question of capitalism and its complication of the effort to think the pertinence or the possibility of cosmopolitanism today. And I will say that I don't know. I think to speak is to fight. I mean, from where I sit, right? It's not just to fight, right? Yeah, it's not just to fight. But you know, from my own experience, if I can appeal to my own experience, there's a difference, certainly in these legal circles in which Bernard and I move, between reason giving and reasoning, right? Reason giving can be weaponized as a tool of power in ways that totally foreclose and shut out the kind of reasoning, the good faith reasoning that is committed to a discourse ethics that is about what you refer to as principles and ideals. And in this disenchanted world, I do think that discounting the reality that the uses of words always takes place against a backdrop, or it always implicates a word politics, right? Questions of power, preemptively incapacitate the prospects for a cosmopolitanism from below, or as I might prefer, a cosmopolitanism from outside. And it goes to this question of translation, right? If in my lived experience, I experienced the problem of translation in English with other English speakers, then I've got to hold open some space for the idea of letting go of understanding, right? Of misunderstanding as a kind of baseline reality, which leaves open nonetheless a space for agreement without understanding. You know, I'd have to spell that out and have to talk about that. But I do think that the German word, I'm not a German speaker by any means, that contains in itself both the idea of understanding and the idea of agreement, which may not be synonymous with understanding, may be a starting point for thinking about what that practice of languaging would look like, which doesn't see not understanding as a defeat, but accepts the possibility that in much the same way that we sometimes have to just, as we say, agree to disagree, right? We sometimes have to agree without understanding the other person's point of view, perhaps on the grounds precisely of these norms of respect, right? That Bob was talking about earlier. And that's not a communication question. It's what, you know, the Derridians, I know I'm thinking of Tom Keenan here, to talk about as a kind of responsibility, which is very different, perhaps even outside of a model of communication in ways that I find attractive. Yes.
Verstehen is a term with a very long history in German thought. It comes out of the hermeneutic tradition, right? And then sometimes in English or translated as empathic understanding. And there was a lot of discussion about whether or not verstehen involved empathy. Now, I think it is a mistake to read Habermas's understanding of Verständigung in terms of the older model of Verstehen. The older model of Verstehen comes from the biblical hermeneutic tradition, which is in the first place understanding the text. That's how it was developed. In the idea of Verständigung, you understand one another, but that is always revisable. You keep reaching an agreement. To use a phrase that Cass Sunstein uses, incompletely theorized agreement. In a discourse situation, you don't have to have perfect agreement. I have to admit to you that, interpreters, like Tom McCarthy, Richard Bernstein, myself, we always try to transcendentalize somebody. Because some of the expressions that were used gave one the impression as a Verständigung implied unity. And it was a mistake. So he transcendentalized it means seeing this as a process of trying to come to an understanding that's always the Thank you. I think these are very, very basic.
All right, well, we thank our extraordinary guests for this rich conversation, which will obviously continue because we have a lot of conversation and feedback, and we've got more to say and for all of us. So, big round. And thank you. Thank you as well for your extraordinary participation and questions. Thank you, Fonda, for organizing everything. Thank you, Reno Mangiapelli, for all the AV work. We'll be back next Wednesday, the 19th. We'll be looking at Utopia and architecture with an incredible group of architectural critical theorists, Shabi Leda Aguirre, reinhold Martin, Felicity Scott, Anthony Vidler. So join us next week. We'll be turning to architecture. Thanks.